Magnus, you read the Munich Security Conference report from last year.
I did.
This week.
Yeah. I discovered that every year, the Munich Security Conference, they releases this big report, an annual report, as they call it. And I sort of felt the pull of the narrative. In a sense, it's a simple one. On the one hand, they see, they have the world of liberal democracies, like mainly countries in Europe and in North America, the United States and Canada. And they're the good ones. They're the good guys. And they are committed, they're defending international law, they're standing up for human rights and humanitarian values, and they have all this, the good stuff in them. And then it's the enemy, the bad guys, and that's mainly, in their view, it's China and Russia, and particularly Russia. They label them the revisionist authoritarians. They had this word, and they are on the bad side, and they are sort of attacking international law. They try to undermine democracy. They don't care about human rights. They don't care about people. And the world is then sort of this massive fight between, on the one side, these liberal
goodies and the baddies.
Exactly.
And where we've seen this before, in every film, everywhere.
And I found that fascinating as an example of storytelling. But then I also sort of got a little bit suspicious, because I know, of course, that the world is not that simple. And there are some parts of reality that just won't fit in that narrative.
I mean, there are no goodies on the international side. Governments are inherently not good.
Exactly. Since then, in October 2023, after the Munich Security Conference had happened last year, of course, there was the war in Gaza broke out with a Hamas attack. And then, of course, the massive Israeli response, which has, produced really catastrophic humanitarian consequences. It's pretty clear that what is going on there is a violation of international law. And I was then starting to wonder, how will this reality fit with the Munich Security Council narrative?
This year, when we look at what's happening in the world, this idea that the Western states are the goodies and the rest are the baddies doesn't really feel as simple story as it was perhaps last year.
So that's what I sort of got interested in, that, these attempts at creating these grand narratives of the world, they're risky, right? Because suddenly reality change, the world changes, and the narrative, the story that you told yourself just doesn't fit anymore.
No, it doesn't hold up to reality when you look at what actually happens.
Exactly. Yesterday, the Munich Security Conference released their annual report for this year. And of course, the big question was, how would they make sense of this? How would they frame the war in Gaza? And I think maybe not surprisingly, they almost didn't mention the war at all.
Which is insane, if I have to say it. I mean, there is no other issue that is at the top of the agenda. How can you not talk about this?
No, exactly.
Not talking about what's happening in Gaza right now is bizarre.
And especially if you care about humanitarian principles, right?
So in 2023, defending international law was a big theme. Was it mentioned in this report?
Well, they just seem to have forgotten completely about international law. The report that was released yesterday, sort of stating the grand narrative of the world today, actually doesn't mention international law at all. The report from last year, there were so many references to international law. There was references to the UN Charter, there was references to international humanitarian law, a lot of references to international human rights law. This year, after the war in Gaza, no mention at all. International law is not mentioned a single time in this year's Munich Security Conference report.
I mean, that's just absurd, right? We've gone through a few months where the world has probably not talked this much about international law, different instruments, different courts, different venues where you take forward international law, ever. And yet it has zero mentions. If your narrative doesn't no longer if reality is just so different than your narrative, then that's when it's propaganda, right? That's when it becomes a propaganda campaign.
Yeah.
And now, you really have to ask yourself, are you still relevant? Are your analysis of these things still relevant? And will people listen?